Hi everyone, it's Pratik. I just wanted to let you know that my latest article just went up on Real Clear History. The title of it is Bush Stood Up to America First Over His Political Future. And I talk in the article about how George Bush, going into his 1992 reelection campaign, was on the political defensive. Um, at the height of his post-Gulf War popularity, his approval ratings had climbed to over 90%. But very soon, due to economic difficulties, foreign policy almost overnight became a political liability. And the primary reason was the economy, but more generally, there was a growing populist backlash in the country that manifested, among other things, in a rising tide of protectionism and criticism of free trade. And, George Bush has long been panned as someone who was a little bit shifty politically. He didn't really have strong opinions. He sort of famously lacked the vision thing. And there's some truth in that, and it's true that Bush did struggle to a large extent in articulating a grand worldview and vision for the country. But I think that one of the forgotten parts of his legacy, and what I draw attention to in my article, which I'll post here in a minute, is that there was one issue that he really was impassioned about, which was America's role in the world and the importance of American international engagement. And he was willing to defend this idea not only in the abstract, but also particularly he was ready to take on and defend this issue of free trade, even going into a difficult presidential campaign. So, what I talk about in the article is that what Bush did was his initial thinking was that some of the attacks on free trade were simply partisan in nature, and I talk about how he attributed the attacks at first to, quote, at one point he said, quote, liberal democratic carping. But he realized shortly enough that this carping, as he described it, was not by any means limited to the Democratic side of the aisle, but in many ways the backlash was strongest on the political right. So what ended up happening that these warning signs developed beginning in late 1991 and then escalated into 92. So in 1991, there was in October 1991, there was this special election in Louisiana, and Republican David Duke, the infamous former Grand Wizard of the KKK, defeated the White House's preferred candidate, Buddy Roemer. And then very shortly after that, on November 4th, in Pennsylvania, the Democratic candidate, Harris Wofford, pulled off a major upset when he beat Bush's former Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh, in the Pennsylvania Senate race. And this was very significant because one of the major features of this upset campaign was Wofford's consistent campaign theme was, it's time to take care of our own. And his campaign aides were going around wearing T-shirts that said sarcastically, the George Bush tour. And this Bush tour, as they described it, quote, traveled anywhere but the USA. So you can see the shifting political winds. And I think a lot of presidents at this point who, were either more cynical or maybe just didn't quite believe in the issue might have backed off or modified their position or their tone. But Bush did the opposite. And what he did was he went on the campaign trail and he went straight to the American people. And he was ready to talk about free trade and American internationalism. And it's important to note here that although obviously the president and his team had begun to articulate a policy and a strategy for what would come after the Cold War, things were still very much in the air, and very significant, prominent strategists, mainstream people were envisioning a fairly sizable retrenchment or withdrawal of American might from the world. And so Bush went on the campaign trail, and he went across the country, and he made three big arguments in favor of free trade. So the first one, and I talk about this in the article, is he argued that, one, we need to keep in mind historical lessons which vindicate the case for free trade over isolationism and protectionism. So Bush argued that he described protectionism as an old flat earth theory defined by a, quote, horse and buggy attitude. And he contrasted this with people who he admired, people like Christopher Columbus, and how they ventured out in the world to explore the Americas. Second, he talked about how American economic engagement in the world was necessary to establish a broader global order that was congenial to American interests. And he called it a quote, stubborn fantasy, the notion that America could, quote, live as an isolated island surrounded by a changing and developing world. And so he went, for example, to the Future Farmers of America in Missouri, and he said, look, this global marketplace that everyone's talking about, it's not somewhere in Asia or Europe, but it's right here, that there are historical opportunities in Kansas City and Birmingham and Bakersville and Silicon Valley. And he said, these noisy voices that want to withdraw us into isolationism and protectionism, this is what he said to the Illinois Farm Bureau, we're ignoring the reality that the only way America would actually remain first, and he's now alluding here to sort of the so-called America First crowd, that the only way America is really going to remain first is if we remain engaged in world markets. And then the third big argument that he made was that free trade was really part of a broader agenda, which he called, quote, the tough, rewarding task of promoting worldwide economic liberty. And this was quite remarkable because, unlike Ronald Reagan, Bush was never really prone to making arguments that really appealed to grand or higher ideals. And so for him to talk this eloquently was quite something. And he said, look, the alternative to a vibrant international economic system that unites markets in every continent was what he called Fortress America, which he argued would doom the country to irrelevance and poverty, and would cost America to lose jobs and close markets. So Bush goes out and he makes these arguments, and he's doing it at a volatile political time because but come December 1991, the presidential campaign now is gearing up, and it's becoming clear that Bush is going to deal with problems not only obviously from the Democratic Party, but also it's looking like conservatives and members of his own party who are already upset with him for a variety of reasons are now have this economic thing as one more gripe. And one of the more significant candidates who would arise here was Patrick Buchanan, who remains quite active. But in the spring of 1990, he had written an article in the National Interest. The title was "America First and Second and Third," and Buchanan, it should be noted, was a Cold Warrior of sorts. He was a prominent Reaganite, but by this point, Buchanan had basically said, look, the Cold War is over. It's time for America to look inward. And Buchanan was, in large part because he was questioning American orthodoxy, American global leadership, he was really surging in popularity. And so, in September 1990, the New York Times was already reporting on the rise of a, quote, what they called Buchanan faction in the conservative movement. And then a few months later, in November 1990, Eric Alterman in The Nation, this is a left-wing publication, described Pat Buchanan as, quote, the most visible of all our superstar political pundits. So, so Buchanan's becoming popular here, and then in December, he announces that he's going to be challenging Bush for the Republican nomination, and he cited for as one of the major reasons the president's internationalism. So he said at one point to his followers, he said, "Mr. Bush's all-consuming passion lies in some gauzy new world order. Mr. Bush is an Ivy League globalist wedded to such institutions as the UN and World Bank, when we Americans have got to start looking out for America first." So you see obviously here rhetoric that is now a part of our political climate. This was really tested out back in the early 90s. And then more bad news comes in for Bush, that basically his speeches, which were never all that eloquent, by a 4-to-1 margin, this is now in early 1991, Americans told Gallup that by a 4-to-1 margin that, quote, we shouldn't think so much in international terms, but concentrate more on our national problems. But Bush doesn't back down now, and he continues to go out there on the campaign trail, and he says, he now plans a trip to Asia, which was long overdue. I mean, and the focus obviously on the Gulf War and the Middle East. There had been questions about America's commitment to Asia and our alliances and so forth in Asia. So Bush makes a trip there, but now he's even under more attack in the U.S. because now this lends credence to the idea that he's not really paying enough attention at home, and so now he's under attack. And Bush says, "Look, the reason I'm going abroad, the reason I'm going to Asia, is because, quote, in this new world order, new world, old notions no longer apply. The sharp lines that once separated foreign and domestic policy have been overtaken by a new reality. If we want to put people to work here at home, we have to expand trade and open markets." And again, this message is falling flat politically. So Bush comes home from Japan, and his approval ratings fall to the lowest point of his presidency. I mean, this is just a remarkable plummet from where he was in the Gulf War to now very low levels. And one of the things that was so remarkable here is that Bush went to Japan, and there was this sort of very unfortunate incident there where the president came down with the flu, and he vomited and then just fainted into the lap of the Japanese president, which obviously didn't paint a flattering portrait of anyone. But this was particularly problematic because at this time there was this, just in addition to being a backlash generally against free trade and international engagement, a lot of this was really driven by fears about Japanese competition, and I was quite surprised when I did the research here on just how much these anti-Japanese sentiments had taken over. So, for example, a majority of Americans believed that Japan would become the leading economic power of the 21st century. A majority feared that the Japanese economic threat was even more dire than the Soviet military one, which, again, even though the Cold War was winding down, the Soviet Union absolutely had a serious, robust military that remained a threat to Eastern and Central Europe. And this was another incredible one to me. 86% of Americans were willing to accept lower or slower economic growth in both the U.S. and Japan if it meant preserving U.S. economic leadership. So there was very much this zero-sum sense of what the U.S.-Japanese competition would look like. And sort of all over the country, 60% of Americans were taking part in a growing, quote, Buy America campaign, which basically meant avoiding Japanese-made goods. The other remarkable thing here is that anti-Japan books were topping the bestseller list. So Michael Crichton wrote The Rising Sun, where he accused Japan of adversarial trade, trade like war, trade intended to wipe out the competition. Some of the things sort of that you hear about China today. And George Friedman, who even today actually runs a fairly prominent political risk advisory firm, he wrote a book which hasn't exactly aged well, but it was quite popular at the time. The title of the book was The Coming War with Japan, and he predicted a military conflict between the U.S. and Japan sometime in the next 2 decades, and he thought that the impetus for the war would be economic tension. Okay, so this Japan thing is happening. Buchanan is already in the race. The Democrats are picking their nominee, and then there's now this third party candidate who comes in, Ross Perot, again gaining just a lot of traction from this anti-trade protectionist backlash, and so Perot announces he's running, and trade policy is at the center of what he's running on. He says, he says we have this major national debt, we have economic problems. Why? And he blamed NAFTA, he blamed Bush's free trade agenda for outsourcing jobs, and very soon, by May of 1992, as remarkable as it sounds in retrospect, Perot actually led the national race. He was polling at 37%, while Bush and Clinton were tied in a distant second at 24%. Now, obviously, Bush fended off this attack from Buchanan in New Hampshire, although Buchanan remained in the race, and he continued to be sort of a gnat in the race. And then George. So at this time now, the Clinton campaign is seeing this three-way race that they're running. They seem to be underdogs, and George Stephanopoulos writes in his memoir, he said that as they were poll testing different messages, one line that Clinton tested out that really did well was sort of arguing that we need a president who cares as much about the Middle West as the Middle East. And when Clinton tested this out, it proved to be popular. The crowds loved it, and so Bush or Clinton ended up using this line over and over again, and it worked. I mean, Clinton ended up winning the '92 election in large part because of the idea that he would be more responsive to American concerns about the economy generally, but also on trade specifically. So I think while there were a lot of reasons, obviously, why Bush lost the '92 campaign, a big one was that he was ready to go out there and campaign in defense of free trade, even when he knew it wasn't popular. And it was quite a courageous thing in retrospect, because even though he ended up losing and becoming a one-term president, I think Bush's advocacy and consistency on the issue was a big part of why there remained a general bipartisan consensus behind free trade, and it ultimately allowed and gave the Clinton administration, once they got elected, the political capital to pursue free trade agreements, expand America's role in the world, and basically oversee, as President Clinton liked to remind, the longest peacetime economic expansion in history. So anyway, I hope you'll check out the article. I'll post it here in a minute. The parallels here, I think, are quite obvious to today. And I think as the presidential election gears up, my hope is that some of the candidates who are coming to the fore, who will be running against Donald Trump, will recognize that this debate about so-called America First economics is not settled, and that the sands and thinking on this issue can shift, but it's a matter of politicians like George Bush recognizing the importance of it, taking their case to the American people, and playing the long game and making arguments about free trade. So yeah, let me know what you think. If you have any questions or comments, and I'll be in touch.